This is the Enigma, the most sophisticated code machine the world had ever seen. The Germans thought it impregnable. Yet at Station X, a secret establishment in the British countryside, they were breaking the code every day. The intelligence from the Enigma messages had the highest rating of all, top secret ultra. It could even win the war. But in 1941, an unexpected problem arose. How to use that intelligence without revealing the Enigma had been broken. By 1941, Britain was losing the war. Her armies had been kicked out of mainland Europe. Her convoys were being sunk in the Atlantic. Her cities were being battered and bombed. Britain's one secret weapon was the intelligence coming out of Station X.
The Germans didn't attach much importance to intelligence at the beginning. You don't if you're winning. They attached importance at the Blitzkrieg and winning the war quickly. We attached great importance to intelligence because we had our backs to the war and we had nothing else that we could rely on.
But a German attack on the island of Crete in 1941 would dramatically highlight the dilemma facing Station X about how to use this precious intelligence without giving away the secret of Ultra. The Germans needed to capture Crete. Right in the middle of the Mediterranean, the island dominated British convoy routes, bringing precious food and fuel. The British were holding on to the island. Hitler intended to change all that. But Station X was already reading Hitler's plans.
Everyone in Hut 6 was terribly excited, and of course we felt in our innocence that with all this new information, it would only be a matter of time before the Germans would really get it in the neck, as it were. We knew that the Germans were going to launch a parachute attack on Crete. We knew the date and we knew where they were going to drop, and we had all the details.
Station X had provided so much information that General Bernard Freyberg, the British forces commander, was waiting as the parachutists arrived. He looked at his watch. "Here they come," he said, "right on time." But these were early days in the intelligence war. Station X and the military were still learning how to get the value of the ultra intelligence without revealing its source.
Churchill laid it down that the source itself was more important than winning an engagement. That's to say that you were not to handle the information you got from Bletchley in such a way that a German or some such person might guess that you had got it from Ultra.
General Freyberg had originally assumed the attack would come from the sea. Once he learned the German plans, he faced a terrible dilemma. He was under strict orders not to give away the source, but he could not protect both fronts. If he changed his strategy, the Germans would know their messages were no longer secret. He tried to split his forces, but to no avail. After bitter fighting, Freyberg was forced to surrender. Britain had lost the island, but the secret of Station X was safe.
It was worth losing Crete to keep Ultra. If you've got the force, you can use intelligence. If you've not got the force, you can't use intelligence. And poor Freyberg could not do it. He had not got the force.
I remember being disappointed, yes, that's right. At the very least, after that, one realised the war was going to go on longer than one thought.
Ironically, the secret that Churchill was so desperate to preserve was going to end up in enemy hands after all. In the heat of the battle, a British secret agent had fled, leaving behind condemning evidence that could destroy Ultra. This message to the agent from Station X revealed that the British had cracked the enigma. It gave precise details of the enemy battle plans. The Germans found the message. They sent it to Berlin. It was even translated back into German and then simply filed away. No one there realized its significance. Ultra was safe. As Britain suffered defeat after defeat, the death toll grew. Station X did not escape. Although they were never bombed and never sent to the front, their friends and their families were. Discovering who had been killed became a daily ritual at Bletchley Park.
In the big hall in the mansion, they put up the Times every day with fatalities, and you always looked at that every morning if you had time. I think we almost became rather like the boys in the RAF when a fighter plane didn't come back. The boys would say, so-and-so's bought it, and the subject would change, and it wasn't referred to.
Tuesday, 25th of July, came off at 6. Pam took me outside to give me some bad news. John has been killed. There seems no point in saying any more. I don't think I really took it in. We walked round the fields and she was quite marvellous. Thank God I had her, it would have been quite unbearable alone. Wrote to Mummy and Daddy. Not a very pleasant day.
I lost an awful lot of friends, and I still miss them to this day. I think that I may shock you, but women hate more than men because they don't have to do the shooting. You'll never find a soldier saying he hates his enemy, but the women do.
As the flow of German messages increased, British coding machines were adapted to imitate the enigma. Once the codebreakers had found the settings for a group of messages, the scrambled letters could be typed in, and out would come the plain German, letter by letter.
The messages came pouring in on these great long sheets off the teleprinters, rolls and rolls, and, you know, we just work our way through it. Dung, dung, you typed it. Dung, 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 dung. And then we tore that off and turned the message over and stuck it all on the back. It's 5-letter group, 5-letter group, 5-letter group, 5, and you'd look at the tape and you could see that it was German. I mean, it was either be total gibberish or it was German.
The strips of raw German letters went straight from the decoders to the intelligence huts. There, intelligence analysts puzzled over the messages and tried to assess their significance.
In those days, there were two wooden huts side by side. One was hut 6, one was hut 3. And they were linked by a little square tunnel through which the decodes passed from 6 to 3. Pushed, as I remember, by a broom handle in a cardboard box. So primitive were things in those days.
First, the intelligence huts had to sort the letter groups into German words and then turn them into meaningful English.
You had this thing on a piece of paper, rather like an old-fashioned telegram, a line of letters, some of which were missing, and some of which didn't make any sense, and you crossed them out, and you made suggestions, and you fiddled away with a pencil. The basis of the whole thing was that it was what the Germans were saying to one another, and that, of course, was the essence of ultra-intelligence.
Huts 3 and 4 were the intelligence huts. It was their job to send Ultra to Whitehall and to the commanders on the battlefront.
I was an academic, a medieval historian. One was used to looking at scrappy bits of evidence in a foreign language and trying to make sense of them. The difference was that lives were going to depend on whether you got it right or wrong. You had to accept the fact that the best possible answer in half an hour could be worth untold gold. An academically right answer in a couple of hours was for the spike.
In the deserts of North Africa, a new German general was making a name for himself with his aggressive attacks on the British. Erwin Rommel was to become a major figure in the story of Station X.
My father was what you could call a warrior. He was more a soldier's general, not a paper general. He was very lucky in Africa, not having been wounded except one day when a British splinter from a shell hit his belt. But the splinter was sticking in the belt and not in his body.
Throughout 1941, the Desert War was swinging backwards and forwards across Libya and Tunisia as the Germans and their allies, the Italians, tried to capture Egypt. With no landlines for communications, North Africa was pure wireless war. The Enigma was vital to Rommel.
My father had never an idea that the German code was broken. He could not imagine that something like this could happen.
Station X was sending ultra-intelligence out to North Africa practically every day. But in April 1941, a message arrived in Hut 6 that was going to cost British lives. Rommel was complaining to Berlin that he was under strength. The High Command decided to investigate.
Hitler sent Field Marshal Paulus to North Africa to see Rommel. And at the end of all these discussions, Paulus, who was an intelligent fellow, compiled a report. And it was signaled to Berlin on a Luftwaffe cipher.
Paulus had chosen to send his report using an Enigma cipher that Station X could always read. One of the British listening posts intercepted that signal. Within hours, Station X was decoding the message. The information that arrived at Hut 3 was dynamite. Paulus had ordered that Rommel should only attack when he could achieve success without substantial losses, as his troops were exhausted. Churchill had requested daily reports from Station X. When he'd read the Paulus message, Churchill could not resist interfering in the North African campaign. He overruled his generals and ordered that the desert forces should immediately take on Rommel. On June the 15th, Operation Battle Axe was launched, but it was the generals, not Churchill, who were proved right. The British were sorely beaten. The Paulus message had been correct in assessing Rommel's strength, but it had underestimated Rommel's military prowess, as had Churchill. As the North African War dragged on, there were still lessons to be learned in using Ultra. All the mosaic of intelligence that was gathered from the messages had to be catalogued. The smallest detail could turn out to be vitally important. Station X was building up a giant card index system.
I was sent to do the cross-reference index, which turned out to be one of the most valuable reference libraries Bletchley or anyone else has ever produced. A very extraordinary form of intelligence.
Every name, every place, every unit mentioned in the decoded messages was painstakingly filed and cross-filed for future reference.
That is intelligence. You very rarely get the top chap saying, my plan of battle is the extermination of the following countries in the next 6 weeks, or whatever. It's putting together lots and lots of little bits and pieces which are all trivial. And that's why the index, which is an enlarged human memory, was key, absolutely key.
Throughout the war, the index grew and filled more and more rooms. But as the information increased, Station X caught a glimpse of what would turn out to be the greatest horror of the war. As Hitler began his invasion of Russia in 1941, certain German signals were being decoded that gave cause for alarm. Messages from the SS and the German border police were recording mass executions and the systematic slaughter of Russian Jews. Reports sent to Himmler in July recorded how over 1,100 Russians were shot. A decode from Minsk reported having carried out 7,819 executions. Many more messages followed. It's now known that this was part of the Holocaust. At the time, no one anticipated the full scale of the genocide. But when Churchill saw the decodes, he wanted the whole country to share his outrage.
Since the Mongol invasions of Europe in the 16th century, there has never been methodical, merciless butchery on such a scale. We are in the presence of a crime without a name.
Churchill was taking a chance that the Germans would realize the enigma had been broken and he would lose Station X. It was a huge gamble. But such was the horror of the crime. Even Ultra had to be put at risk. Step by step, the Enigma was giving up more and more of its secrets to the British codebreakers. And strangely enough, it was the Enigma's greatest strength that also turned out to be its greatest weakness. When an operator typed a message on the Enigma, the machine would replace every letter with a different one. The letter typed in would never come out as the same letter in the code. The Germans didn't realize it, but they were opening another door for Station X.
Ein Fehler bei der ursprünglichen Enigma war ja etwa den Text, den Buchstaben E hatte. Konnte im Geheimtext niemals der Buchstabe E wieder an dieser Stelle auftauchen. Ne? Ich glaube, dass das auch erst sehr spät bei den Deutschen entdeckt worden ist. Aber ich meine, mich daran zu erinnern, dass zum Beispiel also Alan Turing und seine Kollegen das entdeckt haben.
The codebreakers had found a fundamental flaw in the Enigma, and they could make use of it to unravel the messages. As the intercepts were analyzed, it became clear that the Germans were using set phrases time and time again. It was soon possible to predict which message contained a particular phrase. Station X called these phrases cribs.
I remember Nieder mit der Engländer, down with the English. And of course, Heil Hitler. Heil Hitler was enormously valuable. I mean, you should never inculcate in your military anyway the tendency to have exactly the same phrase opening every statement of a great victory.
As military bureaucracy settled into routine, the Germans often sent the same message at the same time every day.
There was one remarkable one which we used to use sometimes to cheer us up as a sort of college yell, because it had such a wonderful rhythm. It went as follows. Nicht anfliegbar, nicht aufgebaut, Giffro, Düsseldorf, Popham, Svo. And you could imagine 6 or 7 adults who had nothing better to do on the night shift, reciting this and feeling a lot better afterwards, perhaps 2 or 3 times in some cases. I mean, that message in itself was pointless. All this said was, you cannot fly from this place, no building has taken place, signed off, whatever. It would have been much better if they hadn't sent it. From their point of view, it was simply the way into the code.
When they had decided on their phrase, the codebreakers then looked for it in a message. Finding the correct position for the crib relied on the flaw in the enigma. The codebreakers lined their crib up against the coded message. As they knew the enigma would never turn a letter into itself, if any pairs of letters matched, the phrase must be in the wrong position. They slid the crib along the message until they found a point where none of the letters were the same. This could be where the phrase was located. Given that head start, Station X could work out the enigma settings for the next 24 hours. For security, the Germans changed the enigma settings every day, and sometimes they sent dummy messages which were meant to confuse the enemy further. But even these had their uses.
We picked up this message and there wasn't a single L in the whole message, which meant that my chap, who was to send out a fake message, had just had a fag and pressed the last key on his typewriter, you see, and that was L, and so that the whole thing had come out without an L, so that one who got probably the biggest crib we ever had, that the encipherment was L, 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 L right through the entire message.
One simple mistake could give away the secret settings of the enigma. The codebreakers became so adept they would create their own cribs. They would ask the RAF to drop mines in a specific stretch of sea. The Germans would immediately send a message giving a grid reference for the mines. Station X knew the grid reference CF97 would be spelt out in the coded German message, so they used Caesar Fritz 97 as the crib to find the enigma key. Station X called this gardening. By now, the codebreakers were not just learning about the enigma, but also the whole system of war communication. They were rewriting the rules of the Code War. In 1941, Ultra was about to face its first major test in a sustained campaign. The African War was the pendulum war, as both sides' offensives ran out of momentum. Churchill was no nearer the victory he craved. But Rommel had one major weakness. The German Africa Corps totally depended on their Italian allies to bring in supplies. Rommel's supply lines were a natural target for the British.
Das Hauptproblem war immer der Treibstofftransport, weil der übers Wasser musste. Und da haben die oft 1000 Kilometer und weiterfahren müssen, dass ein Tankwagen Wasser gekommen ist. Und der ist nicht einmal immer angekommen, weil die sind auch abgeschossen worden, genau wie Treibstoff.
The RAF knew that convoys of Italian supplies were crossing the Mediterranean to Rommel. The Italians sent Enigma messages to make the arrangements, and Station X read the messages. It was almost too easy.
I could not understand how Rommel failed to realize that we were breaking important signals. I mean, he was a superb general. He was winning. But then he started losing because his supplies were always sunk in the Mediterranean.
Station X knew which convoys were carrying what supplies. They could almost pick and choose their targets. To keep Ultra safe, however, it had to look as though the British knew about the convoys from some source other than the Enigma.
There was an absolutely rigid rule that we could not use Ultra unless, first of all, an aircraft had been sent out to reconnoitre. Once the Ultra had been proven by Germans seeing a British aeroplane looking at the convoy, then you could use it, but not until. They might very well say, I wonder how they knew it. But fortunately, they always deluded themselves by saying it must have been an Italian traitor in the Naples docks.
My father ended his life with a suspicion that there was a gap in the Italian High Command through which news escaped and arrived at the British side. But in heaven he must apologize towards the Italians and say I was wrong.
But as was to happen time and time again in the war, an advance in one direction was met by a retreat in another. And through a series of international events, Rommel was soon going to find fate working in his favor. The story began several months earlier in 1941, when a group of American codebreakers had visited Station X. Churchill was luring the Americans into the war by offering the secrets of Ultra.
Spies are not prone to share a great deal straight away, you know. It takes time for spies to warm up with one another, and even British and American spies. They played their cards very close to their chest.
Getting two countries' secret services to work together was unheard of. But against all odds, the visit was a success. From then on, the Americans would share the secrets of the Enigma, but that was going to play right into Rommel's hands. The New Deal meant that the Americans would be kept informed about North Africa. Reports on the British campaign were being sent in code to Washington from the US Embassy in Cairo. In August that year, a local Italian working for the Americans, Loris Gerardi, got hold of the combination of the safe where the embassy's code book was kept. Gerardi copied the code without the Americans ever knowing. Now Rommel had access to British secrets. He knew what his enemy was up to. With the help of the American decodes, Rommel pushed the British back 300 miles in 17 days. The reports going back to Churchill told of disaster after disaster. The situation was critical. If Station X was to give Churchill the victories he needed, the intelligence from the Enigma had to be analyzed as fast as possible. Speed meant lives. One man had the answer. Alan Turing, the leading codebreaker at Station X, had achieved international recognition before the war. Ahead of his time, Turing was developing the idea of intelligent machines. He planned to automate the codebreaking process.
Alan Turing is one of the figures of the century. The world of computing and now the world of the internet stems from Alan Turing's fundamental ideas. There were other great men in Bletchley Park, but in the long, long haul of history, I think Turing's name will probably be the number one in terms of consequence for mankind.
Breaking the enigma meant working out how the operators had configured their machines for that day's messages. The Germans used different rotors with different settings as the first level of scrambling. Then there were the steckers, rows of plugs that could wire the letters of the alphabet together in millions of different ways to produce the next level of encoding. Turing was planning a machine that would attack the heart of the enigma. Once they had a crib, the codebreakers could find the rotor settings, but the process of getting those settings took too long.
Alan Turing's great breakthrough was seeing that finding out the rotor settings from that crib was something that could be done by a machine. That was the great starting point and brought the whole thing into the modern age.
Turing's machine could defeat the enigma in minutes. It was called, strangely, the Bombe.
An average bomb run was about 15 minutes. Occasionally, I heard we beat the Germans to the decryption. This happened when A would send B a message and B would almost immediately send back a message, a very short message which just said, "I can't read you." We would get the solution faster than the other guy could decipher the second sending. And if it was something hot, we could get out in the field before the German commander got it.
The Bombe was a giant electromechanical machine which used drums to imitate a series of Enigma machines. The drums clicked round letter by letter, testing the thousands of possible Enigma settings, 20 every second, until the correct one had been found.
Before Turing, the perceived wisdom was you've just got to go around searching for this one solution which will break a particular message. Turing said no, what you do is you use the mathematical technique of rejecting all things that it couldn't possibly be. So it was a very powerful search engine, but working in a negative sense in that it rejected millions and millions of possibilities very, very quickly and arrived at the correct answer.
Station X was becoming a vast production line. By the end of the war, with over 200 bombs, the codebreakers were turning out 90,000 decoded messages a month.
The algorithmic process, as we'd call it now, by which the crib and the ciphertext were processed on these mechanical systems, they were the most advanced, most complex processes that had ever been used in the history of the world. I can't think of anything else with its logical and statistical sophistication. It's something you should think of as years and years before its time.
The bombs needed people to run them. Station X turned to the Navy. Hundreds of Wrens were recruited.
Well, the first shock was getting the travel warrant, because I was hoping in Portsmouth or Plymouth or somewhere to find Bletchley. It was a terrible disappointment. And straight into Hut 11, and there all these machines were, and we were told what we were going to do, and it was quite obvious that there was no escape.
Initially, I wanted to be a boat's crew. I wanted to be going out to places like Singapore. You know? No, I didn't want to be stuck in the Midlands at all.
The impression was a tremendous noise, clickety-click going on all the time. A lot of sort of heavy, sort of oily smell. I remember the oily smell. And this noise, because there wasn't just one bomb going clickety-click, there might be 10 in each bay, all whizzing round at the same time, all these rotors whirring round. It was very noisy.
The codebreakers used the cribs in the messages to build up a set of instructions for the bombs, called a menu. By teasing out relationships between the letters in the crib, they could then tell the bomb to look for the rotor settings that would turn that message into plain German.
We didn't use words like computer or computer program, but in fact we were computer programmers. We were given a crib and we were expected then to try to produce our computer program to feed to the bomb. And we had to have this great organization breaking messages. In the past, one has pictures of little groups of rather heroic cryptographers who were working on their own to break some difficult message. We were all entirely dependent upon electronics, in effect, to do what we did.
But before the bombs could find the settings, they had to be prepared for each message. The Wren's job was to fix the drums and the wiring on the bombs to see if the codebreakers' menus worked.
The first thing we had to do was plug all these wheels in. And when they were all ready, you went round to the back of the machine and you plugged up the menu. And by the end of that, the back of your bomb looked like Spaghetti Junction. There were wires going up, sideways, inside out, up and down.
When the bomb stopped, you wrote down where the letters were, where they'd stopped at, and you hoped that that was going to be the answer. But occasionally it was because there was a fault on a bomb, so you had to take all your bombs off and with a pair of tweezers tweeze all these horrible wire thingies out till they were all perfect again, then put them back on and start all over again.
Yes. Margaret, this is Anne. Oh, hello. Nice to meet you. Yes, it is, isn't it? I've even got a picture. Remember they had rabbits all up here?
The Wrens at Station X were always known as P5, Pembroke 5. Their unit was named after a ship. Their dormitories were known as cabins. The recreation area was the forecastle, and the buses that took them to and from Bletchley were known as Liberty boats.
Good God, girls, what are we going to do? I was only expecting 18 of you.
Up a bomb?
Yes.
Oh, I think I can.
And put the bomb and the jump on the front
Yes,
and turn the
always.
settings on the front row.
Yes.
And I still say to myself, apple butter Charlie,
Oh,
Dan,
Edward, Freddie, George, Henry, Ing, James, Kenneth,
London Monkey
Nuts, Oliver, Peter, Cracker, Robert, Sugar, Tommy, Unicorn, Vinegar, William, X-Ray, Yellow, Zebra.
See that upper window right in the middle on the top floor? That was my cabin.
Up at the top?
Yes, right in the middle there.
I suppose they pushed you up there out of the way, Dorothy.
That's right, absolutely. Yeah.
The manor houses and stately homes of Buckinghamshire were pressed into service for the new recruits, and the young Wrens found themselves with prestigious addresses that they could never reveal.
If you had a horse, you were allowed to bring your horse down there.
Isn't that an extraordinary thing? I didn't belong to the horsey or the county set, but they did. 2 or 3 of them did bring their horse down because there were stables.
Some of the Wrens who worked at Station X found themselves living at Woburn. The Duke of Bedford had moved out, and his house was up for grabs.
We certainly weren't very naval. Dame Lawton Matthew came round to inspect us one day at Woburn Abbey, and we thought we'd turned on a jolly good job. But she said, I won't comment on your squad drill because it's obvious you don't do any, which we found very wounding. Very much resented the precious free time we'd given up for all the squad drill.
The Bombe Wrens spent their war years commuting between their stately homes and the bomb rooms. Working round the clock on 8-hour shifts, they were subjected to endless noise and never saw daylight. The pressure could be enormous.
There were people who had breakdowns. I heard of one girl who threw herself in the river. Fortunately, she was rescued. I'm sure that's why they had a nursing home which was secure, but I didn't know anything about it. I mean, just that 1 or 2 people disappeared, and one knew they were being looked after.
Very disconcerting.
When you're 17, you're very resilient, but actually it did take its toll. I personally had what would nowadays be called burnout, so I must have been looking very grim. And about a week later, I woke up, and what I realized had happened was that they'd given me a lot of sleep therapy or sedation or whatever. It was very dimly remembered. And I think that's what they did for us when we got burned out.
Churchill, still reading Ultra and still pushing his generals, went to the desert to put his stamp on the war. He wanted results, and he wanted them fast. Out went one lot of generals, and in came another. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery became the new 8th Army commander. It was now his job to defeat Rommel's Afrika Korps. He knew from Ultra that Rommel was about to attack, but where? Montgomery predicted the ridge at Alam Halfa.
Monty said, looking at the ground, he will go with the Alam Halfa ridge. Some days later, we decoded a signal from Rommel saying, I'm going to attack on the 30th of September, the Alam Halfa ridge, which is exactly what Monty had said. I think from that moment on, Monty was so confident of his own intelligence that he couldn't be beaten. He knew everything.
But Montgomery had another advantage. The American embassy in Cairo had realized their intelligence reports on the British campaign were being read by the Germans. They had immediately changed their code. Rommel no longer knew what his enemy was planning. Montgomery, however, was still receiving Ultra from Station X. Soon, the German forces were under enormous pressure. But Station X was beginning to have reservations about Montgomery.
We felt that Montgomery did not trust the intelligence information that Bletchley Park was providing him with, because we believed in our own arrogant way that we were probably providing a service to the military that no other military had ever had in the history of warfare.
On the 23rd of October, the British went on the attack at El Alamein.
Our mandate from the Prime Minister is to destroy the Axis forces in North Africa. We are going to finish with this chap, Rommel, once and for all.
British intercept stations logged over 300 messages a day in the battle that followed. Station X knew Rommel's plans, his forces, and his losses. This was the intelligence war. Montgomery had promised to finish Rommel off. Station X was providing the information that would allow him to do that. On the evening of the 2nd of November, Rommel signalled Hitler for permission to retreat.
Alamein was marvellous because you had these desperate messages from Rommel saying, Panzer Army is exhausted, we've enough petrol for 50 kilometres, ammunition is contemptible and so on. And we have between 11 and 17 operational tanks in the whole of Panzer Army Africa.
Hitler replied the next day, ordering Rommel not to yield a step, either victory or death. Montgomery read both messages within hours. At El Alamein, Montgomery's superior forces crushed Rommel. But when Hut III learned that Montgomery had allowed Rommel and the remnants of his army to get away, they were furious.
We told Monty over and over again how few tanks Rommel had got. So Monty could have wiped Rommel off the face of the earth. Why he didn't do so, why he didn't wipe it off the face of the earth, I simply do not know. Nobody else knows.
Why was the Hut III information not used? It was so full. I mean, that was our exasperation. We were giving Monty every conceivable information about the state of Rommel's troops, the number of operational tanks, which is terribly crucial. I mean, you know, enough, about as many tanks could be parked on the lawn at the back of this house. And in desert warfare, no tanks and you're finished.
This is the BBC Home and Forces programme. Here's some excellent news which has come during the past hour from GHQ Cairo. It says, the Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat.
Outside Station X, there were no complaints. Churchill called Alamein the end of the beginning. While the country celebrated, Bletchley Park got on with its own war. Theirs was a hidden struggle, away from the battlefield and the outside world, but deeply involved in the greatest secret of the time.
You can imagine the comments from the local Bletchley people whose sons and brothers and fathers and what have you were all in the local regiments. Obviously they could see a great many young men in what they reckoned was a very safe and cushy war. So that there was a little bit of feeling, I think, in that respect.
I didn't feel guilty that I'm not at the front because, of course, it was a very different war from some other wars that had been fought. We knew so much about what was really going on in the war, more than anybody else did, I think, that we had kind of vicarious action in that way. We felt we were involved in the action even though we were not there in battlefields.
Receiving the signals, decrypting the signals, was a very exciting thing indeed because we were deputy warriors, wayside warriors. It gave us a feeling of activity, which of course dodging bullets on the battlefield just gives you too, in a more vivid sense.
Station X was growing up. With Alan Turing's bombs at work, 5,000 people were now involved in code breaking at Bletchley Park. That number would double by the end of the war.
December 31st, 1942. Somehow war seems the natural state of affairs, and peace, when it comes, will take a hell of a lot of getting used to.